Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second study this morning in the Bible School on the study in Atonement, part 2. So, today we're going to study something very particular, which is the cultural influences and its effect on the study of atonement. How different cultural influences formed different concepts. What you need to understand when we look at the atonement is that atonement theories didn't just happen in a vacuum. People do like they do with eschatology. Those in the modern time try and interpret an Hebraic book with a particular context and background for themselves in the modern time, and they miss it by a mile. But the point is, the culture, the environment, and the philosophies of the day is what's being used to interpret the scriptures. And so it also happened when it came to atonement theories. Everybody interprets it in the light of their own time, and that's why we have the development and series of these theories. And therefore, in order to be academically honest and theologically correct, we have to stop and look into how cultural views influence the understanding of atonement. And I think the most important is whether our understanding is culturally influenced or whether it goes back or reverts to the original Hebraic intent. So, as a deeper understanding or disclaimer, if you will, about this study, I'm going to again repeat myself in what I said in the previous session. No one within the church seriously disputes the claim that God's great act through his Son Jesus Christ has saved us. We're not questioning salvation through Christ. Salvation is God's initiative and was made manifest through Jesus Christ. Moreover, presumably few would challenge the claim that his salvation involved Jesus' life, teaching, death, and resurrection. That's not even at question here. Jesus' death achieved something or affects something, and it does so furthermore for us. What the theologians tend to speak of as its vicarious function. To speak of Jesus' vicarious death means then, in agreement with almost every true believer in Jesus Christ, that his death is significant, accomplishing something, and that it accomplishes something that benefits us. Nobody questions the vicarious or substitutionary death of Christ. I am highlighting this because in my first series of lectures on atonement, some with cognitive presuppositions heard something that was not said and they went off on their own tangent. So, what do we need to understand? What is therefore at question is not the redemptive work of Christ or his vicarious death, but how redemption was accomplished. Was it some sort of a transaction? Was it restitutive or retributive? What was it? The mechanism is what we want to study. This study of the atonement therefore looks at the mechanism by which reconciliation and expiation was accomplished. It's so important because how we understand the cross is going to determine how we present the gospel. But we have to be honest and serious in our search. And that's why we bring in today the different cultural influences. And what I'm going to do for you, we are going to look at the various atonement theories. And to your astonishment, you'll find I spoke about 10 theories. Those are the major accepted ones, but there are much more of them, and they develop over time within the context of the culture. And we're going to put that together for you. Atonement, therefore, is not so much a work of Christ apart from who he is. We want to look at this whole thing, if we may, holistically, but rather Christ himself in his work. If we don't focus on the person and the whole life of the person and just on a single act at the cross and then only at the part of his death, we are definitely going to come to the wrong conclusion. The whole of life ministry, death, and resurrection of Christ needs to be considered in the work of the atonement. An instrumental perspective on the atonement as an external work of Christ, as something that he does rather than having its ground in who he is. That means if I focus externally, implies a corresponding view. I cannot come to another conclusion but then to think in terms of something of an external arrangement. In other words, it's an action external from the person, and it's to settle some sort of outstanding debt. It is precisely the union of the incarnation and the atonement that includes the view that the atonement is reducible to a forensic transaction as the fulfilling of a legal contract. And we're going to see today, where does this concept come from? Who started it first? Now, I can tell you, it's unfortunate that when things started 1,100 years after Christ, that these people are still seen as church fathers, and I think we should go further back than that to the earliest church fathers to get a more accurate view. Now, just for revision, we looked previously at the following. We looked at the ransom theory, the Christus Victor theory, satisfaction theory, penal substitution, moral influence theory, governmental theory, recapitulation theory, theosis, exemplar theory, covenant theory, economic theory, and hypostatic union and kenosis. Why would I even go through the whole list and make the effort to remind you of them? Simply because these atonement theories were brought forth by real Christians loving the Lord, filled with the Spirit, who were searching the Bible to get to a deeper understanding of the mechanism of how the vicarious death of Christ achieved our salvation, deliverance from sin, and the new birth. That is why it's important. We cannot now decide that we know the answer, that this one particular theory is the be-all and end-all of what Christ did. It's first and foremost important to understand where that came from, how it came into being, what influences brought that theory into being, and whether we understand as a consequence the interpretation of that view correctly. Now, what is important for me first to state is this. We see now that all these theories didn't all happen at the same time, and they didn't happen in a vacuum. There were external influences that let the thinkers of these theories come to these particular conclusions, and I'm going to show that to you now. So we see the early church period, which was the 1st to 5th century. Now, this would be the apostolic fathers. They had the ransom theory and the recapitulation theory. The ransom theory involving particularly a model of the Exodus, like the Israelites coming out of Egypt. Okay. Then, in the 3rd century came Origen, and he developed the moral influence theory. Now, I'm not going to go through all the description. I've done that before, and I invite you to please go and read the quick summary that I gave there. Again, folks, this is obviously not a full definition of that particular theory. It's just to give you a broad strokes idea. So, Origen came up with the moral influence theory. What is the point? It's the 3rd century. Then we go to the 4th and 5th century. Now comes Augustine. And he's a man that first developed some concept of satisfaction. It was not the satisfaction theory that we find with Anselm. He's going to pick up on Augustine's idea. And then he also came up with the first principles of something called a ransom theory. So he picked up that from the early church fathers, but he gave another interesting interpretation to the ransom theory, and he combined these ideas. What is very important to understand is that he developed his satisfaction and ransom ideas out of a Hellenistic philosophical worldview. And I'm going to explain that just shortly. Then we have also in the 4th to 5th century Gregory of Nyssa, who developed the Christus Victor theory. Okay? Now, we go on quite a number of years, or in terms of our natural human history, and we get now to the 11th century, because it was a little bit of a silent few years in between. And up comes Mr. Anselm of Canterbury. Now, he developed something called the satisfaction theory, and I've actually got his book called Cur des Homo, Why God Became Man. And it is written in the form of a dialogue. And Anselm obviously was trying to refute the theories of some of his contenders, and he developed something known to us today as the satisfaction theory, which we will further define later. Now, in the 12th to 13th century, we have Peter Abelard, who developed the moral influence theory. Now, guys, you have to understand that we cannot now stand here and claim all these people are not Christians. That's ridiculous. Okay? But we have to look at why they came up with these theories. Because what you will find that in most of them, it doesn't answer all the questions. It doesn't speak to particular problem statements we find in the New Testament. Further, after Peter Abelard's theory, we now go on to the 13th century and come to Thomas Aquinas, who developed the development of satisfaction theory. Now, obviously, he picked up the ball and he developed the theory further. Of course, then we get to the 16th and 17th century Reformation and post-Reformation period, and now we have people like Calvin and Luther, who started with the concept of penal substitutionary atonement. You have to understand that this theory is one that was built from other theories, but it has an historical development from about the 11th century. Now, I know there are guys who tell you, no, it's a concept that comes from way back. Well, I've also studied the history. I've made a tremendous effort to go as far back as I can, but I would rather say this way, that the whole developed concept of penal substitutionary atonement started here. Maybe there were parts and concepts and thoughts that preceded it, but the teaching as we know it of penal substitutionary atonement started here with Augustine. And now you need to understand, folks, there's a difference between substitutionary atonement and penal substitutionary atonement. Substitutionary atonement is that vicarious work of Christ who acted on our behalf and for our benefit, and the mechanism is what we want to understand. But penal substitutionary atonement links the vicarious work of Christ to the wrath of God, and Christ satisfying the wrath of God and the judicial requirement of God in a legal framework. And that is where we have a problem. And I'm going to, in particular, study this view with all its theological problems specifically because it's the view of Western churches in the majority. Why? Because through the reformers and through what happened particularly in America and Europe, and how those churches were established, and how those reformers fled, Protestants fled with that theory to the West. It was dissipated into the West and Western countries and established as the only understanding of what Christ did at the cross, and people move from one development in the church to the next, but they never change their understanding or insight about atonement. It's just assumed. And so it's become a majority view in the Western church, and that is what we're going to look at in detail. Now, going further, we now get to the modern period from the 18th century to the present. We've got a few interesting developments. We've got the moral example theory that then developed. Then there are other subjective theories about atonement. Schleiermachers, for example, we're not going to look at that in detail, but it's just important for you to know. Well, there were other thinkers, there were other people who developed understandings. Barthian Christocentrism, and that came from Karl Barth. And folks, let me just say something here. There are many people who love to discredit the messenger. You know, normally they can't refute what a man is saying, but they try and attack his character. I detest that. Although we might differ with somebody in their understanding, the objective is not to play the man. Because this is how most modern Christians work. Oh, it's easy. We don't have to listen to him. Let's just discredit him. So I say that particularly because a lot of people I know have questions about Barth. I don't necessarily agree with him. All I'm saying is we don't just discredit something because he said something. We want to understand, honestly, what did the man say? Is there any validity in what he said because he influenced a whole lot of people? Then, of course, we have the evangelical reaffirmation of penal substitution. And here we look at people like Stott, J.I. Packer, and of course R.C. Sproul. These are people, what they call them, the Neo-Calvinists, who are now laying a very strong emphasis on that, and as a matter of fact I find them quite militant about that view. Then, going further, we have postmodern and contextual theories, and then we have the non-violent theories. Now you can of course imagine that under these subsets in the modern time we have again a whole branched out number of views. What I'm trying to show you here is there is a development, and it's not the same in every age. But I would like to know why. How does it work? Do people discover new texts? Do they get better dictionaries? What is happening that they change their view and understanding so readily and rapidly about the atonement? Well, just to make a point, as I said to you, let's just hone in quickly on the one that the West loves in particular, which is the penal substitutionary atonement, or the reaffirmed theory of penal substitution. And as you can see, I've again went into the subcategories of that theory to show you how it was compiled. And it was compiled over different centuries, but with a particular philosophical and cultural influence. What you'll see here is the compilation. We see original sin was something that Augustine started. Now folks, as I've mentioned before, this is very important to understand. If it's true that man is born totally morally depraved, babies are depraved, babies own an insurmountable debt to God by virtue of the fact that they are born, and that they are so morally depraved that even their wills is depraved. If that original sin theory is true, then it follows logically that the remedy for that has something to do with atonement, and therefore it follows logically that Christ must literally be made a sinner in a similar manner as man is born into. So you can see that what one starts with is going to lead directly to a conclusion on what must happen at the cross. And I'm not making any further comments on that. I'm just showing you the importance of how these doctrines stack together to lead to a logical conclusion when it comes to atonement understandings. Now, I must say I have many friends and acquaintances and enemies who cling to this particular doctrine, claiming they're not Calvinist, but the very doctrine is actually very well defined and developed by Calvin and people like Luther later. Anyway, so please go through the description that I've given there so that you could see that it's a compilation of thought patterns over time by different men that brought them to exactly this understanding right unto the modern atonement school. But I want to uh, hurry into what I want to show you today. And what I want to show you is the cultural influence in the particular time period. So when we look at the development of atonement theories from the 1st to 3rd century, we are looking at the Hebrew influence on what they thought the atonement was about. Now let's see how they think and how they interpreted that salvific work of Christ. See, first statement. While it's difficult for us to fully appreciate the cultural differences between the ancient Hebrew culture and the contemporary Western Christianity, some elements of Hebrew biblical history differentiates it from the direction that Western Christianity has followed. In other words, there is a clear deviation. We need to understand, in proper biblical hermeneutic, we have to go to text, context, context, historical background, historical context. Otherwise, we're going to try and interpret it for us today and we're going to miss it. Okay? The origins of the Hebrew people and the nation of Israel are covenantal. That's a big keyword. It's, in other words, relational, covenantal. And in order to understand the work of Christ, therefore, from an Hebraic point of view, it has to be linked to a covenantal interpretation. It has to follow a line along all these covenantal relational understandings that they had. Okay? Then, the concept of God's covenantal relationship with a people is altogether missing in the Greek and Roman cultures that have dominated contemporary Christian church. What we need to understand is there was an Hebraic understanding, and then there was an influence of the Romans who were particularly influenced by Greek philosophy. And what we know about the Romans is they would incorporate the belief systems and philosophies of the nations that they conquered. So in the Roman philosophy, we have a combination of Greek and Roman, and later Latin philosophy, Latin thinkers. Okay? And so that is going to interpret in a very specific way what they see and what they think. So we see that there is a major difference. Okay? If Israelite thinking is to be characterized, it's obvious first to call it dynamic, vigorous, passionate, and sometimes quite explosive. Now, I've got a lot of Jewish friends, and I tell you, when they have discussions, they have serious discussions. I'm thinking, hey, they're going to bash each other. And then they just carry on afterwards. And I'm thinking, what just happened here? I'm not used to this. It's dynamic, involved, explosive. They agree to disagree, and they just carry on. Okay? And their relationship with God is not in that sense aggressive, but it's dynamic and relational. It's always been that way. It's covenantal, it's filial. In other words, a father and a family. Okay? Now, Hebrew thinking is covenantal, filial. Greek thinking is very much like Roman thinking, impersonal, static, and judicial. Whoa. Okay, so we see that even in the use of Greek words in the New Testament. It already, once we use it, moves away from something descriptive to a name, from something active and descriptive to something static. Because it's how their culture, philosophy, and language works. So immediately we run into a hurdle of interpretation. And we're going to see that. The next thing is it's static. For example, how do they view God and man? See, they start with a philosophy about God. And please listen to this, folks, because we're going to drill into it next week. They start with a philosophy. Normally, that philosophy about God would be something diametrically opposed to or different from man. Man is mortal, so God is immortal. And they start to build, man is finite, God is infinite. They start to build philosophical concepts of God. Whereas in the Hebraic mind, that never happens. They don't construct a God and then fill in the blanks. They are relational, filial, covenantal. They discover God as they walk with God. He reveals himself to them as he takes them through things. And in that they discover God dynamically and actively involved in their lives. That's not Roman and Greek approach. To them, everything is static. For example, when you get to the atonement, God is all of this statically. He's in actual fact so static that nothing can move it, and they came up with a word called impossibility. Nothing can move God. I mean, nothing that humans do, say, or think. Okay, and that's a theory. The Hebrew says, sorry, that's not how God works. We know him actively involved with us. And because they have that static view, they start with a concept of man in a static state. Man lost that state and is in another static state. And salvation, therefore, has to be something that restores you from one state to another finished. There's nothing dynamic in it. It's not relational. It's judicial. It's static. And you can already see what the problem would be. For example, when I now come to the atonement theory and I think about it, it becomes something judicial, something to be solved, something that the Son and the Father will do. I just have to believe it. I'm not actively involved. It's static. It's restoring a state. It's typical Hellenistic and Roman thinking. It's so far removed from how a Hebrew interpretation would be that we run into trouble. Okay, further on. I say in terms of Hellenistic and consequent Western thinking, God and man each respectively are in a static state, and the idea of dynamic interactive relationship is completely absent. So the whole redemptive interpretation is therefore going to be to restore static conditions. Now, folks, I want to invite you. I don't have the time to give a whole series of lectures on the Hellenization of Christianity, but I do challenge you to go and search it. There are really wonderful books available, for example, on Kindle, that you can buy and read about how Hellenistic philosophy and Roman thinking influenced the way we look at the Bible. I think it's crucial because we have departed from the right way. Further, what is Hebrew influence? Well, the Western mind tries to convert the Bible into systematic understanding. It's typical Western Hellenistic Roman thinking. We work out systems because if I've worked out the system, I withdraw myself from it. It's an whole intellectual exercise and it's systematic. So I figured it out, right? But the Hebrew mind is a relational narrative of God and a people interacting over time. You see, the person is directly involved. The other one is just the intellect, an exercise and a system that I've worked out. And isn't that exactly what our faith has been reduced to because of our inheritance of a way of thinking that we never think about? The Hebrew understanding of the reality of things is also holistic, including all of creation. Now, there's a problem, okay? This is important in the interpretation of the work of Christ, since full redemption must include the restoration of the whole created order. You see, when we reduce it to a judicial action, when we reduce it to something static, and when we reduce it to something only applicable personally, only for an elect few, then what's happening? It's transactional and judicial, and it is limited to only a punishment, a particular penal substitutionary atonement. The only thing that's focused on is the punishment, which we will investigate. It's just the punishment that counts. The life, the resurrection, and the restoration of all things through atonement is not considered. And there's already a big problem. It means if I only have a theory that focuses in on one particular aspect, I only have a theory. It doesn't address the whole complexity of issues. Then, Hebraic thinking is deeply embedded in the Jewish tradition, and it says it basically is defined as follows as a consequence. It's a holistic view, life and spirituality as a unified whole. It doesn't separate nature and our environment from the man. That's Greek thinking, Roman thinking. It's covenantal relationship, okay? And the sacrificial system is as a consequence viewed as a system that maintains relationship. Because as we will see in the study of the Levitical sacrificial system, there's an emphasis on the cleansing, purification, and sanctification of blood to maintain relationship. And that idea should be carried forward when we get to Christ. Now, there's a collective focus, whereas in the Hellenistic and Roman view, it's very, very individualistic. We think about, I'm saved. And that's why the church has gone passive as far as reaching out and influencing others and their society is concerned. Further, the Hebraic thinking is action orientated. In other words, there is actual participation. Now think about this, folks. I'll just run ahead a little bit of myself. If we look at a substitutionary system, for example, focusing in on Yom Kippur, we'll see that that sacrifice was never participated in. They never ate of it. They never participated in it. Okay? But when we get to the interpretation of an Exodus and a Passover meal, you see that those who were led out also had to participate. That's typical. It's a participatory salvation. It's not something static outside of myself, judicial and legal and static, which I merely have to agree with as a systematic way of thinking. It has to have a physical effect and there has to be a personal participation in it. Okay, and that should already point us in the direction of the Hebraic interpretation of the atonement. Now, let's go further. Now we get to the Romans. Why is it important? Because they are definitely going to have an effect on how we understand atonement. And guys, I mean, we live in this country where this country is still governed by the principles of Roman law. Very interesting. Don't tell me they don't have an effect. Don't tell me their philosophies don't have an effect. Don't tell me the Greek philosophy don't have an effect on modern times. It changed history. And it, as a consequence, also changed the interpretation of the Bible. Further, let's just mention it quickly. I'm just going to rush through these. There are a few thinkers in Roman influence that actually came from the Greeks. Okay? As I said to you, the Romans assimilated the Greek philosophy into their understanding and worldview because that's typically how they functioned. So we have Stoicism and particularly Mr. Aurelius and Epictetus. Okay, we have those things which is a belief in a rational or orderly universe governed by divine reason. Can you see? Okay, here comes our mindset. Oh, let's figure it out. Let's order it together. Let's make it systematic, and that's how it works. We just need to find the principles, and that's exactly how people want to view atonement. Let's just get to the rules. Okay, should make you think. Then Epicureanism. Okay, that was the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of fear and pain. It's just important to know. Then, because I think that has influenced how people think about the Bible and the gain of pleasure and success. Then we have Platonism and New Platonism. Now this is important because why? You see, early Christian theologians such as Augustine were deeply influenced by Platonic and Neoplatonic thought. And what was that? Well, it's the existence of an eternal transcendent realm of forms and ideas. It's also the idea of the soul's immortality. Now you need to listen, folks, because it leaves us with a lot of questions, and I think it's not the purpose of this series to address that, but we're asking questions, okay? Because Mr. Augustine, it is said in history that he struggled with the first time he read the Bible, because we are told that for 11 years he was involved in Manichaeism, and I believe afterwards he returned to that philosophical approach in life. But he struggled to understand the Bible, and he was told to read it, to read the philosophy of the Greeks first, and to read the Bible through Greek philosophy. And it's for this reason, even until today, that you get teachings available by academics who will tell you that Christianity is nothing but Greek philosophy. Did you know that? You just go and search it for yourself on YouTube. They claim that the Christian New Testament and Christian doctrine was written based on Greek philosophy. I mean, how preposterous. But it's reasonable if one looks through the eyes of Augustine, who read the Bible through Greek philosophy and then came up with a number of things that is influencing and directing the church still today. Okay? So we have New Platonicism by Plotinus, and he emphasized the one and the accent of the soul to unity with the divine. Now look what that does for us. The Christian doctrine of the soul's immortality, the eternal realm, and the existence of a higher spiritual reality were closely aligned with Platonic ideas, as was the postulated by Augustine. I don't know if you saw the problem there. So Augustine came up with the idea of the eternal soul, which will later influence the church on its doctrines of the eternality of mind and eternal destiny. Okay? The idea of a higher, more perfect reality and the dichotomy between the physical and the spiritual world influenced Christian teachings about the kingdom and salvation. So what they typically would do under this mindset is the natural is evil and the spiritual is good, and they would separate the two, completely different from the Hebraic worldview. And guess what? The culture and philosophies of the time influenced the way people interpret the Bible, whether you like that or not. So then came the Roman influence further in terms of their legalism. Rome was very well known for its laws and principles of laws, okay? Its governance. So what did that do? The concept of divine justice in Christian theology, especially regarding the atonement, was influenced by Roman legal structure. It could be no other than some sort of judicial satisfaction in terms of Roman interpretation. Because why? It's separated from covenant, it's separated from a filial relationship, and it's separated from unity between man and creation. It's separated from the natural and the spiritual, and it is systematic and legal. And obviously that's now going to influence what you think and how you think about what actually happened at the cross. Further, we have a man like Tertullian, who first postulated the Trinity and Christian theology of the nature of God. And there is a very interesting thing. So this man came up with a theory of the attributes of God. Now, folks, I come out of a theological background where I was taught the attributes of God. I now do a new series called The Attributes of God from an Hebraic Point of View, because this one is philosophical, and I was taught that. And what you do is you come up with a philosophical concept of God with words that are not even in the Bible, and then you try and link the scriptures to it. And it leaves you with a problem. It leaves you to wrong conclusions. What I need to understand about God is how he chose to reveal himself. And we find that throughout the Old Testament and then ultimately in Christ. He chose to reveal himself to man in a particular way. Man didn't construct an idea of God and then linked their circumstances to it. It's a hugely different approach. And it's very important when it comes to the understanding of the atonement. Do I make sense this far, guys? It's fine. Okay. Now, further, we then come to Augustine of Hippo. Augustine synthesized Platonicism and Neoplatonicism and Christian theology, shaping Christian views of free will, grace, original sin, and atonement. His view of sin as an infinite offense against God and the necessity of divine grace heavily influenced Western Christianity's understanding of salvation and the Bible. Folks, look, what I'm trying to show you is that atonement theory is developed over time, and in each time slot we have different philosophical influences and different cultural influences. And these theories of atonement did not happen in a vacuum. They were most definitely influenced by the people of the time in perspective of how they viewed the world in that time. That's important to understand. Schools of thought, yes, absolutely, schools of thought. Okay. So when we come to a conclusion finally with Mr. Ambrose of Milan, Ambrose's interpretation of scripture shaped early Christian attitudes towards biblical authority and the sacrament, particularly baptism and the Eucharist. So here we go. Why? Because typically in the Roman world, it was very important to have ritual. They built a lot of disciplines into their households with the father as the head and ritual in the family. And what Mr. Ambrose did, he took that understanding of his society and he built it into church dogmatics. Okay? And hence we sit with an inheritance that very few people ask questions about. Okay, further, we got the Greek influence, and I quickly want to rush through that. The Greeks began to think about the natural world from a more abstract and general perspective. See, what we just did now, we looked at the Romans, but the Romans have a amalgamated view with the Greeks, and now we're just looking at the Greeks quickly. So they had an abstract general perspective. As far as we know, they invented an explicit theoretical and abstract view of nature. Oh, do you understand how important that is? It's theoretical and abstract. Do you think that might have an influence on how they think about what Christ did? For sure. Further, what we find now is that Plato, in which the knowledge of the material world gained by the senses of no account, but true wisdom residing is in a disembodied reason, contemplating the immaterial and the permanent truths. And I mean, basically what he did here is he detached him from the observances in the natural, separate the natural from the spiritual, and then went into these philosophies of what he would call disembodied reason. Okay? So this is now important. The Greeks lay in their viewing knowledge. The genius of the Greeks lay in their viewing knowledge abstractly and theoretically. Isn't that is precisely what happens with an Hellenistic view in terms of what we look at when we look at the word of Christ, the work of Christ, and we can see that in the theories that developed under these cultural influences, it's abstract and theoretical. And to be honest, folks, for me, that was my initial problem coming from the background where I came from. I started with a study on Christology years ago. As I said to you, I've developed now, it's actually more than 50 lectures just on the centrality of Christ. And what I discovered there was a God that revealed himself completely different than what we previously had theorized. In Christ, God showed his heart. Okay? It's not just in what he did at the cross, but in who he is. He is God in the flesh. That should change my understanding completely about the heart of God towards humanity. And then in the Christology, I discovered the desire of the Lord to reconcile himself with man by him taking the initiative and bringing us into relationship. And this perfectly coincided with the Hebraic understanding of a filial covenantal relationship. And I started to get a problem and a grievance with a misrepresentation of a wrathful, angry God who himself killed his son and poured out his wrath on his son at the cross. And as a matter of fact, we're going to investigate that. And every single proof text that was used to prove that, and every claim, and see whether there's even an indication in the sacrificial system of the Old Testament that points to a sacrifice to appease wrath. And to your surprise, you'll discover none. But we'll get there. Anyway, I'm running ahead of myself. Further, we see the influence now of this Roman Hellenistic way of thinking on the atonement, and that's what I quickly want to do. So the legalistic understanding is this: Roman thought views atonement through the lens of law and justice. Okay? Justice and punishment. Atonement is often understood as satisfying the requirement of justice. The death of Jesus can be seen as a legal penalty paid to satisfy divine wrath. Where does that thinking come from? Well, right there you have it. In the system, in that society, in that time period, because when did this penal substitutionary atonement idea develop? And from which basis did it develop? And from whose philosophy? Guys, I think what I'm trying to show you, look, quite frankly, you don't have to agree. Just think with me and study with me. Do you want to build a theory of the salvation, the salvific work, and the vicarious work of Christ based on unchristian philosophies? Do you want to start with philosophy and then come to a conclusion about what was done? So in other words, I must get my wisdom from outside the Bible? Anyway. So individual responsibility, the individualistic approach in Roman thinking places strong emphasis on the individual responsibility and accountability. Atonement is often seen as addressing the guilt and punishment due to the individual sin. It's not viewed in the bigger lens of total restoration of peoples and creation. Okay? So the legal status of the individual is emphasized in a legalistic system, and as a consequence, what is important is for those who subscribe to this particular approach of atonement, the fact of the matter is, I'm legally in right standing. I have legal grounds. Not relational, legal. Now there are some who claim that it's judicial and is restorative and restitutive. I beg to differ, and we'll see that in the study. Further, under this influence, that's now Roman Greek, we see authority and sovereignship. God as sovereign ruler. Roman thought emphasizes God's authority as a sovereign ruler who enforces divine law. Atonement is seen as upholding the majesty and order of God's rule. You see, typically in a particular view, God is this divine sovereign. Justice must be done. He will enforce the law, because if he doesn't, then there's some sort of injustice committed. Fact of the matter is, he is the judge. Fact of the matter, judgment day comes at the end. At the end. Okay? And therefore nobody's going to get away. Penal substitution. The idea of penal substitution, where Jesus takes on the punishment deserved by sinners, aligns with the Roman emphasis on justice and legal satisfaction. Okay, now let's go further. We see now, so what I'm doing now is just in conclusion to show you how Roman Hellenistic views influenced atonement. And what we did was to make it very clear that it's actually Roman no, Roman and Hellenistic view is very difficult to separate. Just mentioned to you they're philosophers. Those philosophers influence Roman approaches, and then I've shown you a few Greek approaches, but the two actually work together to bring the same effect on the understanding of atonement. For most Western Christians, God exists somewhat like Plato's form of God in a separate world that we call heaven. So there's this, he's not actively involved. That's the effect of a philosophy. God is transcended outside somewhere there. He's not actively involved. Everything is static. Everything is predetermined. Nobody can help nothing. The salvation is about the restoration of static positions. It's not a covenantal, filial, relational thing. God is not here personally actively involved. It's just about a legal transaction that I believe in. It's positional. I take a legal stand, but it doesn't ask any transformation or active involvement of me. And that's the big problem. Not one of the big problems. It's an abstract principle. Now, again, there's this individual focus, emphasis on personal salvation. Um, there's this rational explanation. Okay, it's all within a framework and a system, and that's what I wanted to highlight. And then lastly, there's this concept of ritual, where it ends up, because of that philosophical approach, there's no real relationship, but it results in a personal morality and a form of legalism. You see, folks, what I'm trying to show you in terms of the interpretive view, we can come to different conclusions about the mechanism of salvation. But that mechanism and understanding of salvation will have a direct impact on me. Okay? If I understand it in an Hellenistic and Roman worldview, it will result in a mental agreement of a system, a systematic thought pattern, and a legal stand, and it will result in an external form of personal morality and legalism. I will act the act, but there's no life connection. Because to me, because I have that worldview, it's not covenantal, it's not filial, it's not relational. It doesn't ask for my active participation. As a matter of fact, to be true, I've counseled many people over the years since '89, and I can tell you one thing that I found. Every time people have this particular view of atonement, they don't need to live the Christian life because they have a legal position. Whatever happens, don't worry, folks, it's paid for yesterday, today, and forever. Because I just fall back on a legal stand. That's not relational, and it's deadly. It doesn't lead to transformation of the individual. Anyway, we're going to drill into a lot of problems about misunderstandings on the atonement. What I wanted to highlight, in order to be honest and theologically correct, we can't just, number one, assume we understand the mechanism of the salvation. We have to be honest and say, well, there are many that developed over time. We have to be honest and say, well, cultural, philosophical influences and belief systems influence the interpretation of the mechanism of salvation. We have to be honest to see that the Hellenistic and Roman worldviews had the major impact on Western society's understanding of the Bible. For that reason, there was in recent years such a big move to Hebraic roots, Hebraic understanding, not Hebrew roots movement, because we don't believe in that, but getting things into its Hebraic context. And I'm not talking modern Hebrew, because the modern Hebrew language has nothing to do with ancient Hebrew and ancient Hebrew culture. Okay? We've got to understand that also. By just speaking modern Hebrew doesn't mean you understand ancient Hebrew, and there are many scholars who would echo that thought. Anyway, so we got to go back there. We got to go back to the context. We've got to go back to what was initially understood. And then we will study the book of Leviticus. We will study all the New Testament writings on the sacrifices. We will study what the New Testament writers and apostles said, and then ultimately we'll study what Jesus said. And that should bring us to a much more accurate understanding of what this atoning work was about. Again, let me emphasize it, folks. Nobody questions the vicarious death of Christ. We want to understand, but Lord, how, what happened that I can walk free and my sins cleansed. Amen. Thank you.